Well, I just have a very, I suppose, middle-class background. We went to probably the most powerful Catholic school in Melbourne, Xavier. Yeah, with 8 ovals. I don't know what it is about my sexuality at that age, but people always sort of referred to me as either a woman or as a fag or not a fag, puffin was the word then, but to me it was like water off a duck's back. Yeah, I mean, I can even remember the first day I saw him. I mean, like, very pretty Italian boy. From about the age of 14, I think, we were at school together. He hung around with the sports meets, and I hung around with all the arty-farty fairies. I mean, he was sort of a bit chunky in those days, because he was also, like, a footballer and all that. But he was very beautiful, and we happened to be in the same class. I suppose it took a process of about 2 or 3 years for us to even become friendly. Pep rang me up one day and said, "It's so obvious you like this boy, you know, what are you going to do about it?" And I went, "Well, I don't think I'll, I don't know. I was really nervous about it." And she went, "Well, listen, he's a divine man. You're a divine man. Why don't you do something about it?" You know, it was like, so I was getting this bit of pressure. And then we had this dinner party at my place where 3 of the women, myself and John, were there. I mean, I think she's responsible for a lot of things in my life. But there was a thing where she said, "Oh, now come on, Tim, you have to sit next to John." You know, my mother then walked in about an hour later. And I suppose the next sort of landmark thing within our relationship was during school sports. John was running 100-metre hurdles or something. At the end of the thing, we were all supposed to get back on a bus and go back to the school or whatever, and John and I decided to skip that. So we're sitting on this park bench in school uniform, kissing, till a couple walked past holding hands and just went, "Boys." And so we stopped. We were desperate by this stage. We eventually found this fire escape next door to the Allen's factory, which was on the Yarrabanks. It was the first chance we really had to sort of like have a really good kind of schnog. And it was really, really nice. And I could feel that he had an erection, so that was really pleasant as well to sort of know that this is not just an affectional thing. I used to think he looked like Mowgli from the Jungle Book. We used to sort of kiss and cuddle and stuff all the time and say, "Gee, I wish you were a girl." The suburb I grew up in, there was a set of very old kind of Victorian baths, and he was on the diving board and I had just bombed into the water. And Damien just yelled down to me, "I don't want to be a poofter anymore." And I went, my God, I'm a poofter, you know. It suddenly like hit me like a blinding flash. But I don't think I really realised until that moment that, yeah, well, actually I do want to keep going. There was one night I was coming home on a train and this 18-year-old man sort of sat next to me, and there was no one else on the train, and was saying, "Oh, where have you been?" Blah, 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 and then started talking about pornography, you know. "Oh, you're a Catholic schoolboy, so I suppose you haven't seen pornography." And I was like, "No, I haven't." And he said, "Oh, well, I've got some bisexual pornography. That'd probably freak you out, wouldn't it?" And I was like, "Oh, no, probably not." And then he said, "Okay, so where do you want to go?" And it was like, oh my God, and, you know, so we went off to this park.
How old were you then?
14. I've always been very afraid of people actually finding what I'm really like. And I used to think it was Catholic guilt sort of stuff. If people really saw my soul, they'd see I was evil. As a joke, like 17-year-old boys do, saying, "Oh, let's all have an orgy." Everyone laughed that off, and John and I were sort of like, well, you know. And so we started fondling and getting sexual, which was the first time. The minute I grabbed his dick, he came. It was sort of like, obviously, you know, quite pent up. I don't think he'd even had a wet dream. We sort of did that 4 times that night and were sort of asleep in each other's arms as the sun came up, and a priest walked through the room and just went and kept walking through and walked outside to set up the breakfast table or whatever. I mean, like every night we'd be fighting. Furniture would get pushed around and doors would be slammed and occasional window got broken. A lot of that was put on to me that, you know, that why was I so, I think when I used to get incredibly frustrated, I used to really, I mean, I'm a vicious cornered rat. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I would do anything to hurt my parents. And this is where the argument started. And I said, well, perhaps I should tell you, I mean, this came out actually a bit more violently than this, but I think you should know that I'm gay. I was 17. By this stage, I'd already been going out with John for about a year. My parents were complaining about the fact that I just use the house as a hotel and they never know where I'm going and I always come home late and stuff. Then we went away. I mean, I really did feel like I was kicked into coming up to Sydney, so I did. And we stayed at the Rushcutters Travel Lodge, and there's this huge bed underneath, and I was sort of sitting on the balcony and just watching these men picking each other up for sex and stuff. I said, "Dad, what do you think I said last night?" And he said, "Yes, but I am gay." And I said, "Well, look, I think I am." And then Dad just went quiet. So this was a disastrous weekend. We spent the whole weekend like doing things like going to look at the Opera House and going to Taronga Zoo, and Dad not talking to me, like not because he was angry, but because he was just really in shock. And I was saying to Mum, why is Dad freezing me out like this? And she said, he's just terrified he's going to cry. I was still living with my parents and things were still getting pretty tense and we were still fighting heaps. And Dad said, well, who's died? And what, Dad? You said that you agree to that? The arrangement for my father and his father was that we weren't to see each other again. I mean, this is bizarre. And when you think we were 19, you'd think we were more adult. We would be able to deal with that better than that, but we weren't. We virtually fell under the weight. And it was an extremely distressing time, and our friends were extraordinary. I mean, they were arranging dinner parties for us to come over. I was having a second sexual awakening, I guess. I mean, like I was watching all my friends who were going to come out and stuff, suddenly exploring their sexuality in a way that I had never done. And so there was a tension for me in this relationship, I guess it was feeling like I'd married too young or something, and wanting to become quite sexually active. The strategies I was using was what a lot of people use, which is, sorry, last night I was really drunk and I got off with this person, and John would be devastated for a day and when we get over it, which was happening a little bit. I started to feel like we were going different ways, and John was doing his chiropractic degree and was becoming more and more professional. I was going off and being kind of unemployed nightclubber. Then I auditioned for NIDA, and first time I didn't get in, second time I did. Suddenly the direction of my life changed. This was the start of a new thing, and so I moved to Sydney. By the end of a year in which I'd probably had sex with 2 or 3 men, and they'd all been really hideous, I was getting this incredible stream of letters from John about how much he misses me and all this, and it was really like, I still think he hasn't got it, but also didn't want to lose what was obviously a very important and very healthy relationship. There was this Jesuit who was at school who was actually very supportive of John and I. And anyway, at the end of first year NIDA, when I was having man troubles, I went and saw Brenton and said, look, I want to talk about this. I rang John and said, look, I've been very confused and blah, blah, blah. I'd like to just go away to Adelaide together and see what happens. And so we went to Adelaide and we had the best holiday. Obviously re-established the relationship very strongly. He moved to Sydney in March 85. He had had one relationship in that time, and I'd had one, I suppose, fairly substantial one. I'd had a number of sexual encounters. One of the boys in my house was saying, how can you be interviewing people with HIV if you don't know your own status? So in October 85, we went to be tested. John went in to get his results first. Then he came back out and said, I'm negative. And I thought, beauty, okay, we're fine. I went in and my doctor said, I'm terribly sorry that you're positive. And I said, you're kidding. My lover has just been told that he's negative. And he said, oh, okay, just hang on a sec, and went and got John's file. And then we were both taken back in, and the doctor said, I'm terribly sorry, there's been a mistake. You were given the wrong result. It might have been 81, might have been 82, about this bizarre gay cancer that had happened in San Francisco. And I've always been a kind of an expert on everything. And so, I was just digesting everything I could get my hands on about it. Not so much for myself, but to be able to answer the questions of my friends and impress them at dinner parties. I guess it sort of unfolded. I guess the next significant memory for me was actually when it was named. And that was, I was at NIDA, and I think it was 83, that the syndrome was named. And of course, instantly it was named. There were all these jokes, like, what do you call six village people Band-Aids, and all that sort of stuff. The next significant memory for me was that was hearing this particular documentary called Background Briefing, which was very much about the human side of AIDS. And it was extremely moving. I just burst into tears and just thought, this would make a great play, we have to do it. And that's how Soft Targets actually got. 6 months after buying the practice, we were overseas. John's father was amazed, that you've just opened a practice. What the hell are you doing? You should be there with your patients and stuff. And so we'd gone overseas for this, holiday because we didn't really know how long. And John, being of Italian extraction, wanted to see the country of his ancestry. We were both in Melbourne for my sister's wedding. And John just told his parents on the Friday that he wanted something very important to discuss with them on the Sunday lunch. I think at this stage he'd really only just lost weight, but it was quite remarkable, the weight he'd lost. And things were happening with his health, and so he figured he wanted to tell them. Then I was feeling this incredible pressure. Oh my God, John is actually telling his parents right now. Maybe I should tell mine. And my mother said, and I said, John and I are HIV positive. My mother burst into tears and just said, and my father just didn't say anything. I didn't really have very many problems with HIV until about 1990, I suppose. John was in hospital and had been in hospital for about 2 or 3 months. Just started off with sort of like pneumonias. But then subsequently he had all these other problems like pneumothoraxes, which is collapsed lungs. The tension between myself and John's father has been going for many, many years. And he turned up one day with John's will. And in John's will, it was basically, I got everything. When John was saying, well, Dad, I don't think this is any of your business, that's what I want, Bob got angry and John was saying, but Dad, you don't need it. I mean, gosh. So we agreed to change the wills and I was hysterical at this stage that, this man has no shame, this is none of his business and, it was absolutely vile. He just sort of said, I want you to screw me, and we did. It was a really, I think, a fantastic gift. We were sitting just in vigil for this man who was dying. It was fantastic, and sharing stories, and this was a wonderful moment with his mother for me, because she and I were friends before she found out I was porking the son. And she was actually very funny, and John was groaning. That's what he did for the last 3 days or whatever. And then Bob took me into the corridor and I said, what are you talking about? Are you worried that someone's going to get up and refer to the fact that he's gay or that he has AIDS? And I just said, look, that's against his wishes, but be it on your conscience. So then the funeral happened. I mean, I honestly can't imagine other than a state funeral, a more expensive funeral. I mean, they literally had like 4 hire cars and limos and limo drivers, and 6 priests did the service, and prefects from our school turned up, like boys who never even knew John. I sort of feel like I'm looking down the barrel of my own life at the moment. I've already had PCP and toxoplasmosis. My T cells are 0 and have been since July. So basically I'm available for any disease that wants me. I don't think I'm waiting to die. I mean, I don't think it's very far away. I mean, the only thing I have to live for is these 2 things that I'm writing, which I'd like to finish both of. One's a play, and the other one is the book that I'd like to write about my lover and I, which I've started. And the other thing too is I suppose I've been expecting to be dead for so long that, I mean, almost now the idea of getting to something like 40 would be just like... But, yeah, I think that might be the end, is it not?